Hi, and welcome to session 4 of Reading the Bible for Understanding. In this session, we're going to talk about a detailed analysis of the scripture text. And you may be asking, well, wait a minute, I thought we already did that. And the answer is no, you only think you did. We're just getting started with that analysis of the text. And today we're going to go a little deeper on it into a more refined analysis of the text. So far we have selected the scripture text to study. We have surveyed that text and taken a lot of kind of random notes on what we think about it, just whatever came to our mind. And we have also gone to the commentaries to look at the context, history, culture, geography. And we have a good idea now for the setting of the scripture text, and we've made notes on that. Now, let me just very quickly, as an aside, talk a little bit about the commentaries. I want to remind you again, those really come last. And so what you've read so far in the commentaries is not the commentaries on the verses themselves. What we've used so far in the commentaries is the front matter of the commentaries, the first part of most commentaries, where they address questions like who wrote the book, when did they write it, who were they writing it to, where were they when they were actually writing it, and what are some of the historical and cultural issues in writing this particular book. What is the theme of the book overall itself, the general aim of the writer, and then usually some of the theological issues that are found in that particular book. All these kinds of questions are usually handled at the very beginning of most commentaries before they actually get into the commentary on the text itself. And so far, that's all you've looked at. I don't want you looking at the commentary on the text yet. Remember, that's the last thing we do, and there's a very important reason we do that. We want to get your analysis of the text before we go to the professionals, okay? So I just wanted to remind you of that. I will address the commentaries in more detail in the very last session, session 6. So don't worry about that. It's coming. So now it's time to take a more detailed and refined analysis of the scripture text itself. So this is where we start. You want to start by asking, what are the main points that I've gotten so far out of the text? So if it's a story, for instance, it's a narrative, what is the theme or the thesis of the story? What is the lesson or the lessons that the story is trying to convey? If it's poetry, you want to ask, what feelings and emotions do you get from reading it? And what is the poet trying to say with the poem? Or if it's teaching material, say something from the letters of Paul or from the letters of Peter, you want to ask yourself, what is the proposition or the main teaching point that he is trying to make? So from this analysis, you should get two things. The first thing is you should get the main point, and that's big. You want to know, what is the main point of the text I'm looking at? And then you're also going to get a number of subsidiary or kind of supporting points. And so those are the things you want to write down and get those down first. So the other question you want to ask next then is, how does the writer make those points? Okay. So what method is he using to make the point? Is he using parable? Is he using story? Is it proverb? Perhaps it's a direct argument or a direct proposition, as the Apostle Paul does in many of his writings. Is it indirect language? Irony, sarcasm, both things that actually the Apostle Paul uses as well. So what is he using to get his point across? It's valuable to know not just what point he's making, but also how he is making the point. Okay? It gives you a little more insight into the tone of the conversation or story. For instance, there's a place in the book of Galatians, or Paul's letter to the church at Galatia, where he is arguing vehemently against circumcision as a way to be saved. And that's one of the things they were preaching. So he's arguing against that. And at one point, his argument gets so heated that Paul says, if you're going to submit to those who say you have to be circumcised and get circumcised, I hope the knife slips and they just cut the whole thing off. Okay, so that's pretty graphic. It's pretty crazy, but that's what he says. And that gives you insight into the tone of Paul. Paul is hopping mad. He's upset about this, and he's letting them know it. That's important to know as you read the text. So it's a pretty tension-filled tone, obviously, and that makes a difference in how you're going to approach interpreting that text. So that's an important question. Not only what is he saying, but how is he saying it? And then you want to ask the question, what does it mean in the big picture? So once you have decided what the biblical writer is trying to say, you want to ask the question, what does this mean in the big picture of Scripture or in the big picture of what God is telling us in the Bible? All right, so you want to place it in that context. And you want to make notes about all this. You're really trying to hone down on the main meaning or meanings of the Scripture passage that you're studying. Another thing you want to look at this point are what are key terms and images in the Scripture text. So what are the mental images that the writer is painting with his words? Because he wants you to see them. He wants you to see those mental pictures. And those mental images or pictures are full of meaning. So you want to kind of go into those things. What key words does he use? Are there words that are repeated? Anytime a word or a phrase is repeated in one particular pericope, that's the writer's way of saying this is important. They use repetition for the purpose of emphasis in the ancient biblical languages. They didn't have a boldface type. They didn't have exclamation points. They didn't have ways to underline things. So when they wanted you to really key into something that was super important, they would use repetition to emphasize that. So anytime you see a word or phrase being repeated, that's one that you really need to key into. So at this point, once you do this analysis that I'm describing right now, you should end up with a fairly detailed outline of that Scripture text. And it may be that you never use it for anything, but it's important to get this outline down. So you should be now formulating a pretty detailed but structured outline with points and subpoints, main ideas, that kind of thing. So you say, well, what is that going to do? Well, if you're using this for just personal study, then you now have a great outline that will serve you as a framework for understanding that lesson that it's trying to teach. You may not use it, but that's okay. You now have a really good idea of the flow and the structure of the Scripture text and what it's trying to tell you. And for your personal study, nothing is more valuable. You can also be assured, if you followed all these steps, that it's also very much in the right context so that you're not misinterpreting what the writer is trying to say. If you're doing this for, a Bible study lesson, you're a Bible study teacher, you teach Sunday school or small group or whatever, you now have a great outline that will serve as a framework for your lesson. Now, we're going to get into a little bit more about that, but you may not teach everything on this outline. That's okay. You still have it. It's a lot better to be trying to decide what I'm going to leave out than trying to find things to put in. You now have a detailed, less outline that could serve as the outline for your Sunday school or small group lesson. If you're using this to actually preach a sermon, then you now have a great outline that can guide you as you begin to write your sermon. Now, let me say this outline that we have so far, it's not your sermon. It's not your sermon. And you will not use everything in this outline in your sermon. Not if you want it to be an effective sermon. You don't. Most every sermon I've ever written, I spent more time deciding what to leave out than what to put in, okay? But it will guide you. This framework, if you're writing a sermon, will guide you in the right direction. And more importantly, it will keep you from going in the wrong direction. What we want to build here are rails, not that limit you, but that keep you from going off into a swamp or into the wrong field that you don't need to be going into. So this is what this will do for you, whether you're doing this for personal study, if you're doing it as a Bible study lesson, or if you're actually going to preach a sermon. This general outline that you've come now and refined and defined the points, this will help you in all of those. So now we're getting somewhere. We're actually starting to get some meat on the bones here. You have a framework for understanding the Scripture text that you're trying to interpret. In that framework, you've considered word meanings, you've considered grammar, you've considered the socio-cultural context, as well as the context in the larger biblical canon. You've looked at some of the theological issues, some of the historical issues, all those things. So you are now ready to take everything that you have learned and turn it into something that will make a big difference for the people that you're sharing it with. If you're just sharing it with yourself, it'll make a big difference in your own spiritual growth. So you have all that framework right in front of you now, and you are now ready to take the next step. And we're going to cover that in the next session, session 5. God bless you.